Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this short session for 30 minutes. Tim Baker's my name, and I just wanted to talk about an interesting topic and one that's often neglected with teams, and that is how do we continuously improve the way we do things? Now, I think the truth is we're all so busy, we just don't have the time, or we don't think we've got the time. And because of that, it's only really at a crisis point when we actually down tools and actually change our system or get it operating more optimally. So I'm going to challenge you to the notion that it doesn't take a long time and it can be done on the run and it can be done very effectively. So that's what I want to talk about this morning. I'll be sending you a copy of the slides and the recording at the end of this presentation, so you'll get all of that you need. So let's launch into the topic. Okay, so those of you who don't know who I am, just give you a quick introduction. You can see that I obviously write books. I'm up to book number 12, and I think one of the great things about the COVID crisis, from my perspective at least, is that I've been able to spend a bit more time writing books. So I've got one coming out, Breaking the Proactive Paradox. I think it's out. I think my United States publishers said that it'll be out this week. And I've got another one coming up next year on unlocking employee potential. And I just finished one on mastering feedback. You can see I also present keynote addresses. I'm an executive coach, and I guess you can see there that I still play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition in Brisbane. And at my age, we only play every second week because it takes 2 weeks to recover. So there you go. A little bit about me. All right, let's get into the substance of what we're talking about. Obviously, I'm sort of promoting my book, Winning Teams, the 8 characteristics of high-performing teams. One of the characteristics, of course, is that high-performing teams are always improving their capabilities. And I'm just showing you this slide because you can see I've got some good testimonials from a number of people, both in the sporting world and also Katarina Carroll, who's the Commissioner of QPS here in Queensland. So some nice testimonials, one from Nick Farr-Jones, who is a former Wallaby captain and World Cup winner, who says something nice about my book. Now, the reason I've got so many sporting analogies there is that I do talk about the All Blacks as a team, a high-performing team. They have a success rate of 83%, which I think is the greatest success rate, male or female, in the world. And so the book, of course, isn't about the All Blacks, but I do use little anecdotes throughout just to make the point that they do a lot of the things that I'm suggesting that you and I should be doing. Now, one of the things that I said before that I think is really prevents us from doing this is, how do we find the time to work on the business rather than in the business? Because obviously improving systems is working on the business rather than in the business. All of us are pressured to get results. All of us have to get the product out the door or the service, whatever it is that we are in business for. So finding the time to actually improve the way we do our business is not really that simple. It's quite challenging. So I want to address that because really at the end of the day, that's probably the main reason. I don't think there's anyone in this webinar this morning who would suggest that it's not important to continuously improve the team, but of course it's about finding the time as well. So I'm going to talk about some debriefing options. I'm going to talk about the after action review, which I think is a brilliant structure for improving systems, how you might use the after action review, and I've got a special offer for you at the end of this session. So I believe, and I think you could probably work it out already, that I believe that the best time to actually improve your systems is when you debrief. And, debriefing on a project or a body of work, I think is extremely important. And again, I think we don't do enough of this. It doesn't have to go on for hours and hours. In fact, I suggest that a debrief can go for 20 minutes and make a huge difference. The trouble is, if we don't debrief and we keep moving on to the next project or the next big thing, what will happen, of course, is we continually repeat the errors that we make, and we never really improve continuously. And so I think the window of opportunity for us is really at the debrief. And so getting your team together and really reviewing what has happened in the project can be a great way to agree upon some ways of doing things differently, maybe faster, safer, easier, perhaps with less red tape, whatever it might be that might be open in that debrief. Now, this is my model of the 8 characteristics, which obviously you can read more about in my book, but ultimately you can see around the outside, there are 8 characteristics of high-performing teams: building trust, sharing leadership, being agile, creating purpose, managing stakeholders, and there you go, improving systems, utilizing diversity, and learning continuously. So from my research and my working with teams, both here in Australia and elsewhere, these are the 8 characteristics I think are critically important to team success. Now, I don't doubt that there are other characteristics, and it may well be that some of those characteristics are more important than others. But we do know that high-performing teams exhibit these 8 characteristics. Now, and one of them, of course, is improving systems. So show me a high-performing team anywhere, and I'll show you a team that's constantly trying to improve and get better, and they find the time to do that. Now, let me give you the good news and the bad news. The bad news is that when you look at those 8 characteristics, you might say, that's a bit daunting. I'd like to be a high-performing team, but where do I start? So there's a lot there. That's the bad news. The good news, though, is that my suggestion to you is just to work on one of those characteristics. So, for example, if you work on building trust, then it's likely to improve shared leadership. It's likely to improve utilizing diversity, for example. So what I would do tactically is I would just take one of those characteristics and I would work on it until it was effective. And the good news is that that will impact positively on other characteristics around the model. So that's the way I'd go about it. Now, obviously today I'm going to look at improving systems, but you can start anywhere around the wheel. Now, as I said earlier, I in the book, I do talk about the All Blacks, and being an Australian, I often get, I was getting a little depressed about getting beaten every year and every match. And I thought, well, if you can't beat them, learn from them. So I did do quite a deep dive into how the All Blacks operated and found some very interesting things that they do off the field, which really does explain why they have that 83% success rate that I talked about earlier. But I won't go into that, obviously, today in great detail. But what I will do is just start talking about your options around reviewing. And this little table has come from my book in chapter 18, of course. And I just wanted to talk about this because what are your options for debriefing? Now, let's just talk about it for a moment. Now, you can see at the top, you've got formative and summative. Now, summative means at the end and formative means throughout. So basically, when you're working on a project, there's 2 places that you can debrief. You can debrief regularly throughout the project, and many of you would do that, or you can debrief at the end of the project, and many of you would do that. So you've got 2 options there. Do I do it during the project incrementally, or do I do this at the end of the project? It's your choice, of course. Now, over on the right-hand side, there are 2 different types of debriefs. One debrief is an informal debrief, and an informal debrief is one that might be ad hoc. It might be one that's done casually in the corridor, could be done on the spur of the moment. And a formal debrief, of course, for larger projects is where there might be a written report or some sort of a verbal presentation. Now, depending on the size of the project and whatever, it might be that you bypass the formal debrief. So what you've actually got are 4 options open to you. So with a formative debrief that's informal, that would require regular dialogue. That would require you just sitting down with the team and working through some of the issues that are in play at the moment. Then you've got a summative informal, which would be the end of project debrief. Now, I'm going to suggest that that's a sweet spot, and I'll talk about that in terms of the after action review. Now, in terms of formative, you've got the check-in, which is basically an opportunity that is scheduled in the calendar where you would have, a check-in with your team members to see what is going on. That would be a scheduled meeting. Or, of course, you can have an end of project report, which might be written or verbal. So you can see you've got 4 options. And I would suggest the sweet spot is at the end of the project debrief. That's where I think you'll get the greatest results for the least amount of effort. So having said that and giving you a little framework, let's now talk about the after action review. Now, sadly, the after action review, which comes from the military, the US military, were the first organization to introduce this. Sadly, what's happened is a lot of organizations are using it as a quality control measure. And why that's sad is that it becomes a box ticking exercise, a formality that we go through as part of our QA. And that probably doesn't give the technique a great rap. It doesn't really utilize it to its full extent. And that's why I suggest that the informal debrief at the end of a project is the sweet spot. And Peter Senge, who is a bit of a guru in organizational culture, basically, as you can see there, says that the after action review is the most successful organizational learning method ever or yet devised, which is high praise. And he says that for a good reason, and I agree with him. And I think that I would be urging you to be applying this in a more informal sense at the end of each of your projects. Now, when I define a project, I'm talking about a finite start and finish, something where there's a body of work which comes to an end at some point. That's what I define as a project. So let's have a look at how you would do this with the least amount of effort and maximum results. So let's actually have a look at it. Now, we've got, first of all, where might we start? Well, let's start just talking about your own systems and processes and procedures. So in a general sense, as a team leader, you can look at your team and just, spend a bit of time thinking, well, what's actually working extremely well for us? That's a good place to start, because obviously if it's working well for you, you don't need to do much about it, but it's good to know that. And then I would turn my attention, and this is not with your team, I just do this on your own at the moment, so I don't think you get your team engaged in this process yet. But what isn't working or what could be working better, that's a good place to start. Now, let me give you a little tip on this. A lot of people get a freeze at this point and think, well, where do I start? Well, I think the place to start is, what is it that your team does most? What activity does your team do most? For example, if your team is in the business of writing reports and you spend a lot of time writing reports, then I would suggest to you that that's the place to start. And it's fairly obvious, because if that's where most people are putting the most effort in most of the time, then obviously getting a small incremental change in how those reports are being put together or how they're presented will make a massive difference. So I think the place to actually start your continuous improvement is where the bulk of your activity is in your team, not the small things, but the things that are occurring regularly. So if you're in a learning and development organization, then obviously learning and development, maybe presenting training programs, then obviously that's the place to start. If you're in the medical profession and maybe it's dealing with patients and that takes up the bulk of your time, well, then obviously that's where you start. So that's the first focus. And I think it's good for you to get the focus right. And then you can ask yourself the question, well, what improvements or changes can we actually make for the future? Okay, now there's always a payoff because some things are going to require a lot of time to put into place, aren't they? They may cost a lot of money. And so you've got to ask yourself the question, is it worthwhile? Are we going to get a reasonable return on investment if we invest time, effort, energy, money into improving something? So that's got to be a rational decision because obviously we've all got finite time that we're working on things. So I think the first step I would suggest to you is to get your head around where to start, because that gives you some sort of a focus point. And then the next step, of course, is to get your team involved. So how do you do that? Well, first of all, when can you use an after-action review? Now, an after-action review is a fancy name for a debrief, but here's a couple of thoughts where you could actually apply the after-action review. And of course, I'll explain how you do it in a moment. But what about when you're applying a new system or a set of procedures? So something you've actually started that's new. That would be a perfect time to get your team together and do a debrief about what's working, what's not working, and what can we do differently next time. That would be a good place to start. What about after a busy period when capacity has been stretched? So, you know, most organizations have peaks and troughs in terms of the workload. And during a busy period, obviously that's a little difficult because it's all hands on deck. But I think at the end of a busy period, that's a good time to start, all right? Because you can sort of regroup and consider those things. You also apply an after-action review for a trial period of a new system. So let's say you've introduced a new software system or something new procedure has taken place in your team. Well, after a period of time, it'll be a good opportunity if you get your teams together and to work out what's happening. A major training activity would be another place where I could do an after-action review. Or if you're working in a shift environment where maybe you've got round-the-clock shifts working, a great time to do an after-action review is between shifts, so that when the new team comes on board, the old team can talk to the new team, that is the new team in the new shift, can talk about the things that are working and not working on the shift and basically give a debrief on the new people coming in to do that. So there's plenty of scope, there's plenty of opportunity to do this. It's a question now of just making it happen. And I'll give a couple of examples of some of my clients and how they've used this approach as well. Now, one of the places where it's worked extremely well is you might recall I had a testimonial from the Queensland Police Service, and they're good clients of mine. And one of the detectives in the Queensland Police, senior detective, when she goes out with her team and investigates a murder case, maybe in a home, she told me that before everyone goes home, and it might be sort of early in the morning at 1 o'clock after they've done all the photographs and the fingerprinting and all the other things that people have to do in those sorts of incidents, she doesn't let everybody go home straight away. Outside on the pavement, she gets her team together. There might be 4 or 5 detectives working with her, and she asks them 3 simple questions. The first question she asks is, what went well in this investigation? And that's a good place to start on the positive, regardless of whether it was effective or not. What actually went well, we need to actually acknowledge those things. Then she asks what didn't go well. And regardless of how effective one of those investigations are, there's always something that can be improved. And the third question she asks is, what will we do differently next time we have a similar investigation? So everyone's outside just before they get into their cars and drive home and probably exhausted emotionally from what they've had to deal with. She does that right at that space where the rubber meets the road while it's fresh in people's mind. And that is her way of continuously improving. Takes 5 minutes. Everyone's used to it. They know that that's what's going to happen. So that works extremely well. Now, another place where it works extremely well, I find, is in startup firms or places where there are minimal procedures in place. And during these sorts of businesses, of course, you don't want to turn it into a bureaucracy, but by the same token, you need to embed systems and processes in place, ones that will work, obviously, and ones that will serve the need. And in these cases, this is a great opportunity at the end of a project to get the team together and ask them the question. And a lot of my clients are startup firms, and they use this very, very effectively. And again, we're only talking, 15 minutes of a debrief. And the reason this works psychologically is that people don't argue with their own data. So in other words, what that means is that when you get your team together and you do a debrief, the people who give the information in those debriefs, which is obviously your team, they are going to adhere to whatever's been decided for the very simple reason that they've been asked and they volunteered. So, the other side of it, of course, is you could sit there and say, right, I noticed this happening, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this. Of course, you may well be very logical and you may be very considered in your point of view, but the point is your team members haven't had any input. So the magic of the after action review is that you're taking your team with you on the journey of continuous improvement. And because they've got skin in the game, it's likely that they're going to adhere to the outcomes of the debrief. So that's the magic of it. I've done this with councils as well. And, councils, of course, are dealing with major projects in regional areas all the time. Sometimes I've been called in to run the debrief or the after action review. Other times it's done by the mayor or maybe the CEO. There might be members of the community engaged and invited in. There'll be members of council. There will be some elected representatives. There might be some experts who were involved in the project. Perhaps it might be an infrastructure project or whatever. And they'll sit down and they'll run through 3 simple questions. And those questions are the key to this. I'll go back one. The questions that are important to you are these, and you can apply these regardless of what your industry is. The 3 questions that are critical, and there are, of course, a number of versions of after action reviews. I don't believe in complicating it. And remember, I said the sweet spot was around that informal. As you can see in front of you, that's more of a formal approach. But the informal approach is great. So the 3 questions are these. What worked well? Now, even if it was an absolute disaster, there's always something that went well. And I think that if you can capture what that is early on, it's great. Now, you keep asking the question until you get some different results. And of course, you take the personalities out of it. This is all about improving systems, remember? So what went well? It's a good idea to record this. So, I mean, if I was in a room, I might write these things down on a whiteboard, or if you want to do it more formally, of course, you can get someone to record this. Then once we've exhausted that list and we've created what we might call an upward spiral of positivity, we then will turn attention to what didn't go well. So what you would then ask is, what didn't go well? Now, even if it was a magnificent success story, the reality is there's always something that didn't go well. So you get your team focused on those things. And again, I would record those things. I might write them on a whiteboard, or I might, have somebody there and delegate them as the scribe. So what I've actually done by asking these two questions is I've created a distinction between what went well and what didn't go well. And that leads to the magic question. And the third question is this: what will we do differently next time? Now, there will be a next time, as you know, and this is a great question. This is where systems improvement comes into place. So you can then ask that question, and then you will get some very good considered suggestions by asking those two questions first. And then, of course, you can turn attention to saying to your team, well, can we agree upon this? And then, of course, make it happen. Now, some things that might come up from the discussion with that third question may not be practical at the time, and you need to discuss those things. But inevitably, by doing this after action review, there will be one or two really good things that come out of it. And you're getting the people who are actually engaged in the work to give you the suggestions. So the second piece of magic out of the after action review is you're not doing all the heavy lifting. You are engaging your team in the process of continuous improvement. And that's why this is very useful. And many of these people obviously will have firsthand experience about what might be done differently next time. So 3 key questions: what went well, what didn't go well, and what will we do differently? And then you can move from there. So you can see that it doesn't take a lot of time. And if you could just implement this process at the end of your projects and the different times, as I mentioned, you will create a culture of continuous improvement just by doing this. And I can tell you that it doesn't take that long. And of course, you can use it individually. So if there's one person who's new to the team, they've taken on a challenging project, you can say to them, what went well? You can do this in the corridor. What didn't go well? And what have you decided to do differently next time? So it can be done in a one-on-one or in a team environment. Okay, so some of you are dedicated followers of my Friday sessions, and I really appreciate your support. And every Friday at 10 o'clock, that's Queensland time, I have one of these sessions. Now, next week, and you're most welcome to join, I'm going to talk about framing feedback for maximum effect. And that'll come from my latest book, as I mentioned, coming out very soon, Breaking the Proactive Paradox, Maximizing Performance Through Empowerment. And you can see the link on the page there. And remember, you will get a copy of these slides, and you can just click on that link as you did for today, and you're in. So I'm just giving you a little bit of a heads up on what's happening next Friday. And one last thing before we wrap up, if I may, as I just wanted to mention that my book, Winning Teams, if you'd like to know more, and if you'd like to learn how to actually assess your team around those 8 particular characteristics, and you'd like some models and processes and procedures such as the after action review, if you send me an email by the close of business today, I've got a batch of books here in the office, and I will send a book out to you for $25, including postage, which is a really good deal. Now, if you purchase this normally through the normal channels, when you include postage, you're probably talking around $40. So what I'm going to do is I'll send you a coupon. You can go onto my site. You can pay either by credit card or PayPal, whatever you choose. And the moment I get notification of that, of course, is I will personally sign the book and send it out to you ASAP. So that's my offer for you today because you attended. So I'll stop sharing for a moment. So folks, that's it from me. I strongly urge you to try the after action review. It works extremely well, and I think you'll get a tremendous amount out of it. And if you're already using an after action review, try and define it to those 3 questions that I mentioned, and don't try and complicate it. Don't turn it into a QA type of setup, because really I think the magic of it is when it's done in a genuine way to improve systems and processes. So that's it from me. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend. And we look forward to catching you perhaps next Friday. Thanks, everyone. All the best. Bye for now.